At first, there is only land, open, wide, and patient. Wind moves across it without resistance. Grass bends, water flows, time passes. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, something begins to change. A path appears where feet have walked again and again. A fire pit leaves a darkened circle in the soil. A few stones are gathered, not by chance, but by intention. This is where the story begins, not with towering walls or grand temples, but with something quieter, with a question. How did humans, once wandering across vast landscapes, come to shape entire cities from earth, stone, and imagination? It is a question that does not rush to answer itself. It lingers. It unfolds slowly, like the turning of seasons. Because ancient cities did not appear overnight. They were not designed all at once. They grew, layer by layer, decision by decision, hand by hand. If you were to stand in one of those early places, long before it could be called a city, you might not notice anything remarkable at first. A few shelters, some smoke drifting upward, voices carried softly by the wind. But if you stayed, if you watched, you would begin to see a pattern forming. People returning to the same place, again and again. Why here? Perhaps there was water nearby, a river that moved steadily, offering life without asking for much in return. Perhaps the land was gentle, easy to walk, easy to work. Or maybe it was something less visible, a feeling, a sense that this place could hold them, and so they stayed a little longer. At first, their structures were simple, temporary, meant to be left behind. Branches woven together, animal hides stretched against the wind, shapes that could be built quickly and just as quickly abandoned. But something subtle began to shift. Instead of leaving, they repaired. Instead of moving on, they returned. The idea of permanence, once unfamiliar, began to take root, and with it came a new kind of thinking. If we stay, what should we build? This question is at the heart of every ancient city. It echoes through time, because building is not just about materials, it is about intention. The earliest builders did not have blueprints. They did not have machines or measurements as we know them today. What they had was observation. They watched how the wind moved. They noticed where the ground stayed dry after rain. They learned which materials lasted and which ones did not. And slowly, through trial and memory, they began to shape their environment. A wall here to block the wind. A roof there, angled just enough to let water slide away. Each decision small, each improvement quiet. But together, they began to form something larger. Not just shelter, but structure. If you imagine walking through one of these early settlements, you might notice how the spaces begin to organize themselves. Not by strict design, but by habit. Paths form where people walk most often. Cooking areas gather near shared spaces. Sleeping places cluster where it feels safest. Over time, these patterns become more defined. The settlement begins to remember itself. And this is where the mystery deepens. Because no single person builds a city. It is not the work of one mind or even one generation. It is the result of countless choices made by many people across many years. Choices that slowly align. It is cooperation, often unspoken. Someone gathers clay. Someone shapes it. Someone else places it carefully, one piece atop another. There is no grand announcement, no moment where the city suddenly declares itself. Instead, there is continuity, a quiet agreement to keep building. And yet, even as these early communities began to take form, they faced a fundamental uncertainty. How long would they stay? This question lingered in everything they built. Structures were still modest, materials still chosen with caution, because permanence is not just a physical decision, it is an emotional one. To build something meant to last is to trust the future, and that trust does not come easily, but slowly, almost gently, it began to grow. As seasons passed, people noticed something important. The places they built began to shape them in return. A stable shelter allowed for deeper rest. A fixed gathering place encouraged shared stories. A consistent environment made it easier to plan, to store, to prepare. Life became less about constant movement and more about continuity. And with that shift came a new kind of possibility. What if this place could become more than a shelter? What if it could become a home? The difference is subtle but profound. A shelter protects. A home holds meaning. And meaning changes everything. When a place begins to matter, people begin to care for it differently. They repair more carefully. They build more thoughtfully. They imagine what it could become. And so, the earliest foundations of cities were not just physical, they were emotional. They were built from memory, from habit, from a growing sense of belonging. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The quiet rhythm of work, the soft murmur of voices, the steady placement of one stone after another. There is no rush. Time moves differently here. Days blend into seasons, seasons into years, and with each passing cycle, the settlement becomes more defined. Edges sharpen, structures strengthen, spaces take on purpose. A central area might emerge where people gather not just for necessity, but for connection. Paths become more permanent, walls more deliberate, and still no one calls it a city. Not yet, because a city is not just a collection of buildings. It is something more complex, more layered. It requires not just construction, but coordination, not just presence, but planning. And those ideas are still forming. At this stage, everything remains close to the earth. Materials are taken directly from the land: stone, mud, wood. There is a kind of harmony in this. Nothing feels imposed. Everything feels grown. And perhaps that is the most important clue. Ancient cities were not forced into existence. They emerged, like patterns in sand shaped by wind, like rivers carving their paths over time. They were the result of countless small decisions, guided by necessity, shaped by environment, and held together by human connection. But still, questions remain. How did these early settlements evolve into something larger? What challenges did they face as they grew? And how did people, without modern tools or knowledge, begin to build structures that would last for centuries, even millennia? These are not simple questions, and the answers are not quick. They unfold slowly, just as the cities themselves once did. For now, we remain at the beginning, at the quiet edge of something forming, a place where land meets intention, where movement begins to slow, where the first outlines of permanence begin to appear. If you imagine standing there at dusk, you might see small lights flickering, fires carefully tended, people gathered close. The air is calm, the work of the day is done. But beneath that stillness, something is continuing, a process that does not stop, a quiet transformation. Because even in rest, the city is growing, not upward, not yet, but inward, in thought, in connection, in possibility. And this is how it begins, not with noise, not with grandeur, but with a simple, enduring idea. We can build something here, and perhaps we can stay. Before there were cities, there was motion. endless, patient motion. Groups of people moved with the seasons. They followed herds across open plains. They traced the rhythms of rivers and rains. Life was not rooted in one place. It unfolded across landscapes. To stay too long in one area was to risk scarcity. Food would thin. Water might fade. And so, movement was not a choice, but a necessity. Each journey carried knowledge. Where the berries grew sweetest, where the animals returned each year, where shelter could be found when the sky turned harsh. This knowledge lived not in maps, but in memory, passed quietly from one generation to the next. And yet, even within this constant movement, there were moments of pause, places where people lingered just a little longer. A river bend that offered clean water and fish, a valley that softened the wind, a stretch of land where plants grew predictably year after year. These places felt reliable, and reliability has a quiet power. It invites people to return. At first, the stays were brief, a few days, perhaps a few weeks. But with each return, something subtle began to change. Familiarity deepened. People began to recognize not just the land, but their place within it. A certain tree became a marker, a particular rock, a meeting point. The land itself began to feel known. And from that sense of knowing came a new thought. What if we didn't leave so soon? This idea did not arrive suddenly. It was not declared aloud. It emerged slowly, like a question carried on the wind. At first, the decision to stay longer was practical. Perhaps the hunting had been good. Perhaps the weather remained gentle. There was no urgent need to move. So they stayed. And in staying, they noticed something unexpected. The land began to offer more when they remained. Seeds dropped near their camps began to grow. Food scraps left behind returned as new plants. Animals became more predictable in their movements. The connection between people and place deepened, and with that connection came a quiet realization. The land could be shaped, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. A patch of earth could be cleared. Seeds could be placed deliberately. Water could be guided, even slightly. These early acts were small, almost tentative, but they marked a profound shift. For the first time, humans were not just moving through the landscape, they were beginning to work with it. This was the beginning of settlement. Not yet a village, not yet a city, but something new. A place where movement slowed, where time began to gather. If you imagine walking through one of these early settlements, you would notice how life begins to change in subtle ways. Objects accumulate. Tools are no longer carried constantly. They are set down, stored, returned to. Food is not just gathered, it is kept. Storage becomes important. Simple pits in the ground, containers made from woven fibers or clay. The idea of later begins to matter, and with it comes planning. If food can be stored, then time can be stretched. If tools can be kept, then effort can be saved. Life becomes less immediate and more continuous, and continuity invites structure. Shelters begin to change. They are no longer built for quick departure. Instead, they are reinforced. Walls become thicker, roofs more carefully layered. Materials are chosen not just for availability, but for durability. People begin to think, if we are staying, this should last. And so, the earliest permanent structures begin to emerge. They are not grand, low, simple, close to the earth, but they hold a new kind of intention. They are built not just for today, but for tomorrow, and perhaps even for many tomorrows. As more people return to these places, something else begins to happen. The group grows, not suddenly, but steadily. Families remain. Children are born into the same place their parents stayed. Generations begin to overlap in one location. This is something entirely new. For the first time, memory is tied not just to experience, but to place. A child might hear a story and look around, realizing it happened here. The land becomes layered with meaning, and with more people comes a new kind of challenge. How do we live together in one place? This question does not have a simple answer. It unfolds gradually. Tasks begin to divide. Some people focus on gathering, others on shaping tools, others on maintaining shelters. There is no formal system, but there is cooperation. A quiet understanding that survival now depends not just on movement, but on coordination. And as this coordination grows, so does complexity. Paths become more defined as more feet walk them. Shared spaces emerge, areas for cooking, for working, for gathering. The settlement begins to organize itself, not through design, but through use. If you step back and observe from a distance, you might notice something remarkable. The shape of the settlement begins to resemble a pattern. Clusters of shelters, open spaces between them, paths connecting everything. It is not random. It is the result of countless small decisions aligning over time. And this is how structure begins. Not from a plan, but from repetition. What works is repeated. What fails is quietly abandoned. Over time, these patterns solidify, and once they do, they become expectations. This is where we walk. This is where we gather. This is where we rest. The settlement, once fluid and temporary, begins to feel stable, predictable, and in that predictability, something else emerges. Security. To stay in one place is to risk vulnerability, but it is also to gain control. Familiarity with the land means fewer surprises. Stronger shelters mean better protection. Shared knowledge means faster response to challenges. Life is still uncertain, but it is less chaotic. And that difference changes how people think. Instead of constantly asking, "Where do we go next?" they begin to ask, "What do we build here?" This shift is quiet, but transformative, because it opens the door to imagination. If you are no longer preparing to leave, you can begin to envision a better shelter, a more organized space, a place that reflects not just survival, but intention. And with imagination comes ambition, not loud or dramatic ambition, but a steady, growing desire to improve, to refine, to build something that lasts. As these early settlements continue to develop, they begin to face new realities. The land must support more people. Resources must be managed carefully. Decisions begin to carry longer consequences, and so awareness deepens. People observe the cycles of seasons more closely. They learn when to plant, when to harvest, when to store. Time itself becomes structured. Days are no longer just moments. They are part of a sequence, and that sequence shapes life. Morning tasks, midday work, evening rest. Patterns form not just in space, but in time. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the settlement becomes something more than a place to stay. It becomes a system, a living, breathing network of people, actions, and structures, all connected, all interdependent. This is the quiet beginning of something vast, because within these early settlements lie the foundations of cities, not in size, not yet, but in concept, in the idea that humans can live together in one place, not just temporarily, but continuously, that they can shape their environment, organize their space, coordinate their efforts, and perhaps most importantly, that they can belong to a place. If you return to that early settlement at night, you might notice how different it feels from a temporary camp. There is a sense of continuity. Fires are not just lit, they are tended regularly. Shelters are not just occupied, they are maintained. There is a rhythm, a quiet stability. And within that stability, something begins to grow. Not just structures of wood and earth, but something less visible. Trust. Trust that this place will hold. Trust that others will remain. Trust that tomorrow will unfold here just as today did. And from that trust, everything else will follow. The path towards cities has begun, not with walls or towers, but with a simple, powerful shift. From movement to stillness, from passing through to staying, and from staying to building. As the settlements grew more steady, a quiet tension began to emerge. It was not loud, not immediate, but it was always there, just beneath the surface. Because staying in one place brings a new kind of difficulty. When people moved, they could leave problems behind. A dry season, a failing food source, a place that no longer offered enough. They would simply go elsewhere. But now, leaving was no longer so simple. The more people built, the more they invested. The more they invested, the harder it became to walk away. And so, for the first time, humans had to face challenges that could not be escaped. They had to solve them. Slowly, carefully, together. If you imagine standing in one of these early settlements, you might notice how everything still feels fragile. The structures, though more permanent than before, are not yet strong. Walls made from packed earth can crack under heavy rain. Roofs of branches and reeds can shift in strong winds. Fire, once a source of warmth and light, can become a sudden danger. Nothing is guaranteed to last. And so, one of the earliest challenges of building was simply this: how do we make things endure? It is a question that seems simple, but it unfolds into many others. Which materials hold together over time? How thick should a wall be? How should a roof be shaped so water does not collect? There were no written answers, only experience. Trial and error became the teacher. A wall that collapsed would be rebuilt, perhaps thicker, perhaps reinforced with stone. A roof that leaked would be adjusted, angled differently, layered more carefully. Each failure was quiet, but it was remembered. And slowly, knowledge began to accumulate. Not in books, but in practice. Another challenge soon followed: space. At first, the settlement had felt open. There was room to spread out, room to build without much thought. But as more people stayed, space began to tighten. Shelters were built closer together. Paths became narrower. Shared areas grew more crowded. And with this closeness came a new awareness. Where should things be placed? It was no longer enough to build anywhere. Placement began to matter. A shelter too close to a cooking area might fill with smoke. A pathway blocked by storage might slow movement. Water sources needed to remain accessible to everyone. These were not abstract concerns. They affected daily life, and so a kind of quiet planning began to emerge. Not formal, not drawn, but understood. This space is for gathering. This area is for work. These structures belong near each other. The settlement began to organize itself more intentionally. And with that organization came another challenge: coordination. When only a few people were involved, decisions could be simple. But now, with more individuals, more families, more needs, things became more complex. Who decides where to build? Who gathers materials? Who maintains shared spaces? There were no rulers, no written rules, but there were conversations, sometimes spoken, sometimes implied. A kind of agreement began to form. Not always perfect, not always smooth, but necessary, because without coordination, the settlement could not function. And so, early forms of leadership began to appear, not in the sense of authority, but in guidance. Someone with experience might suggest a better way to build. Someone with knowledge of the land might advise where to place structures. Respect grew naturally around those who understood more, and in that respect, decisions found direction. Another quiet difficulty began to surface as well. Resources. The land, once abundant, now had to support a growing number of people. Wood for building, clay for shaping, stone for strengthening. These materials were not infinite. They had to be gathered carefully, used thoughtfully. If too much wood was taken, nearby areas would thin. If clay was overused, the land itself would change. People began to notice this, not all at once, but gradually. The environment responded to their actions. And so, another layer of thinking was added, not just how to build, but how to sustain building. Where should materials be gathered from? How often? How much? These questions did not have exact answers, but they encouraged awareness, a sense that building was not separate from the land. It was part of it, and that relationship had to be respected. Then there was the challenge of weather. Rain, wind, heat, cold. All of these forces had always existed. But now, with permanent structures, their impact became more immediate. A heavy rain could weaken walls. A strong wind could tear at roofs. Heat could dry materials too quickly, causing cracks. The settlement had to adapt. Shelters were adjusted to face away from prevailing winds. Roofs were angled to guide water away. Materials were chosen not just for availability, but for resilience. Observation became even more important. People began to read the sky, to anticipate changes, to build not just for the present, but for what might come. And perhaps the most subtle challenge of all was time. Because building something that lasts requires patience. It requires thinking beyond the immediate moment. A wall built quickly might not endure. A structure assembled without care might fail. And so the pace of work began to change, slower, more deliberate. People began to understand that effort invested now could reduce effort later, that careful construction could prevent future repair. This idea, simple as it seems, was transformative. It introduced the concept of long-term thinking, of building not just for today, but for many tomorrows. If you listen closely, you can almost sense the shift. The rhythm of work becomes steadier, less rushed, more thoughtful. Each action carries intention, and with that intention, the settlement grows stronger. But challenges did not disappear. They evolved. As structures became more durable, expectations rose. A stronger wall invites a stronger roof. A more stable shelter encourages further expansion. Building is never static. It is always in motion, always responding. And so, the people within these early settlements became not just builders, but problem solvers, observers, adapters, collaborators. They learned to work with limitations, to turn constraints into guidance, because every challenge carried within it a question, and every question invited a solution. How do we build stronger? How do we use less? How do we live closer without conflict? These questions did not have final answers, but they moved the settlement forward, step by step. If you step back now and look at the settlement as a whole, you might notice something new. It no longer feels temporary. It feels intentional, not perfect, not finished, but purposeful. Each structure placed with some thought, each path shaped by repeated use, each space carrying meaning. And yet, it is still fragile, still evolving, because the idea of a city is still distant, but the foundation is forming, not just in stone or earth, but in understanding, in the ability to face challenges not by leaving, but by adapting, in the willingness to build, rebuild, and refine, and perhaps most importantly, in the quiet realization that problems are not obstacles to settlement. They are part of it. They shape it. They define it. And in learning to solve them, people begin to unlock something powerful, the ability to create complexity, to build not just structures, but systems. And from those systems, something larger will emerge, something that stretches beyond a simple settlement, something that begins to resemble a city. But for now, we remain here, in this moment of learning, where every wall tells a story of trial, every roof reflects an adjustment, every space holds the memory of a decision. The challenges are many, but so is the determination. And slowly, quietly, the settlement endures. If you follow the story of early settlements, you begin to notice something quiet but important. They are not placed at random. They gather in certain kinds of places. They return to specific environments again and again. And over time, these environments begin to shape what those settlements become. Because land is not just a backdrop. It is an active participant. It offers, it resists, it guides. And in doing so, it quietly influences the rise of cities. If you imagine standing at the edge of a great river, long before any city exists, you might feel something steady in the air. The sound of water moving, the gentle rhythm of its flow. Rivers were among the first places where settlements chose to stay. Not because they were easy, but because they were reliable. Water is life. It provides drinking water. It supports plants and animals. It allows for travel even before roads exist. But a river is more than a resource. It is a system. It floods. It recedes. It changes its shape over time. And early settlers had to learn this. At first, they stayed near the water's edge, close enough to access it easily, but over time, they noticed patterns. Floods would rise during certain seasons. Water would spread across the land, leaving behind rich soil, and then slowly it would return to its banks. This cycle was both a challenge and an opportunity. Too close, and the settlement could be washed away. Too far, and the benefits of the river would be lost. And so, people began to choose their locations more carefully. A slight elevation, a natural rise in the land, close enough to reach the water, but high enough to remain safe. These small decisions shaped entire settlements, and over time, they shape cities. If you move away from rivers and imagine a different landscape, perhaps a wide open plain, you begin to see a different kind of possibility. Plains offered space, wide stretches of land where movement was easy, where visibility extended far into the distance. For early communities, this meant something important. Awareness. They could see what was coming. Animals, weather, other groups. There was a sense of openness. But plains also carried challenges. Less natural protection from wind, fewer immediate resources like wood or stone. And so, settlements in these areas had to adapt differently. Structures were built lower, closer to the ground. Materials were gathered from farther distances. Effort was distributed across a wider area. Life on the plains required balance between openness and vulnerability, between space and resource. And in that balance, settlements began to take on a different shape, more spread out, more connected by long, gentle paths, still organized, but in a quieter, more expansive way. Now imagine a different place entirely, a valley surrounded by hills or mountains. Here, the air feels different, still, protected. Valleys offered something that plains and rivers did not always provide. Shelter, natural barriers against wind, protection from sudden movement, a sense of enclosure. For early settlers, this created a feeling of safety, a place where structures could grow without constant exposure to the elements. Water often flowed through these valleys as well. Smaller streams, predictable sources, and the land itself, shaped by erosion over long periods, often provided fertile soil. These environments encouraged settlement, but they also created limitations. Space was defined by the surrounding terrain. Expansion had boundaries, and so settlements in valleys often grew more compact, closer together, structures clustered tightly, paths weaving carefully between them. There was less room to spread outward, so growth moved inward and upward. Even in these early stages, you can begin to sense a shift. The land is no longer just influencing where people settle. It is influencing how they build, how they organize, how they live. And from this interaction between land and intention, cities begin to take shape. But there were also harsher environments, places where survival itself required constant effort. Deserts, for example. At first, these might seem like unlikely places for settlement. Water is scarce. Temperatures shift dramatically. And yet, even here, people found ways to stay. Not everywhere, but in specific places. Oases, small pockets of water surrounded by otherwise dry land. These became gathering points, not large at first, but essential, because in a desert, even a small, reliable water source becomes a center. And around that center, life begins to organize. Structures are built close together to conserve effort. Materials are chosen for insulation, to manage heat. Life moves with a different rhythm, slower during the day, more active when the air cools. Every decision is shaped by the environment, and in that shaping, a unique kind of settlement emerges. One defined not by abundance, but by careful balance. Now imagine a coastal landscape where land meets the vast open sea. Here, the air carries a different feeling. Movement, possibility. The sea offers food, fish, shellfish, and other resources. It offers pathways. Long before roads, the water becomes a route, connecting distant places. But the sea also brings uncertainty, storms, changing tides. And so, settlements along coasts had to be placed with care. Protected bays, natural harbors, places where the water remained calm enough to allow stability. Over time, these locations became more than just settlements. They became points of connection, places where movement and stillness met, where goods, ideas, and people could arrive and stay. And this added another layer to the idea of a city, not just a place to live, but a place to connect. If you step back now and consider all these environments together, rivers, plains, valleys, deserts, coasts, you begin to see a pattern. Cities do not grow in isolation. They grow in response to water, to land, to climate, to opportunity, and to limitation. And each environment leaves its mark. You can almost read it in the layout of early settlements. The curve of a path following a riverbank, the tight clustering of homes in a valley, the careful spacing in a desert oasis. These are not random choices. They are responses to the world, and over time, these responses become traditions, ways of building, ways of organizing space, passed from one generation to the next. This is how environment becomes culture, not through instruction, but through repetition. If a certain type of structure works in a windy plain, it is built again. If a certain layout protects against flooding, it is remembered. And slowly, these patterns become identity. This is how we build here. This is how we live here. And as these identities deepen, settlements begin to feel distinct, not just in location, but in character. One settlement may feel open and spread out, another enclosed and compact, one shaped by water, another by stone. And within these differences, something important emerges. Diversity. Not all cities will be the same, even in their earliest forms, because they are shaped by different forces, different challenges, different possibilities, and this diversity becomes a strength. It allows for adaptation, for innovation, for the exchange of ideas. But for now, the story remains quiet. We are still in the early stages, where settlements are growing, but not yet fully formed, where environments are guiding, but not yet fully shaped by human hands. If you walk through one of these places at the end of the day, you might notice how deeply connected everything feels. The structures seem to belong to the land. The paths follow natural lines. The materials reflect what is nearby. There is a harmony, not perfect, not complete, but present. And within that harmony, something continues to build, not just outward, but deeper. A relationship between people and place. One that will grow more complex over time. One that will eventually give rise to cities that are not just functional, but remarkable. But that comes later. For now, we remain here, in the landscapes where it all begins, where rivers guide, where valleys shelter, where deserts challenge, where coasts connect, and where, slowly and quietly, settlements begin to become something more. As settlements settled more deeply into their chosen landscapes, another quiet transformation began to take place. It was not about where people lived. It was about what they built with. Because every structure, no matter how simple, begins with a choice. A material gathered from the world, something lifted, shaped, placed. And in those choices, a kind of language begins to form. A language of earth, stone, wood, and time. If you imagine an early builder standing at the edge of a settlement, they are not looking at blueprints. They are looking at the land, at what is available, at what can be carried, at what can endure. The earliest materials were the closest ones. Earth beneath the feet, branches from nearby trees, stones scattered across the ground. Nothing was imported from far away. Everything came from within reach. And because of this, early construction was deeply local. A settlement near a river might use mud and clay. A settlement in a rocky valley might rely on stone. A forested region would lean on wood. Each place built differently, not by choice, but by necessity. And yet, within that necessity, there was creativity. Because raw materials are only the beginning. What matters is how they are used. Take earth, for example. At first glance, it seems simple, soft, loose, easily shaped, but also fragile. A wall made from dry soil can crumble quickly. So early builders began to experiment. They mixed earth with water, creating mud that could be molded. They added straw or plant fibers, strengthening the mixture. They pressed it into shapes, letting it dry slowly under the sun. This was not a sudden invention. It was a gradual discovery, a process of noticing that adding something small could make something stronger. And from that noticing came one of the earliest building techniques, Mud brick, simple blocks shaped by hand, uniform enough to stack, strong enough to hold. And once these bricks were made, something changed. Building became more predictable. Instead of placing irregular materials together, builders could now repeat a shape. One brick, then another. A rhythm emerged, a quiet repetition. And with repetition came structure. Walls became straighter, corners more defined. The settlement began to take on clearer lines. Now imagine a different environment, a place where stone is abundant, scattered across hillsides, layered within the earth. Stone offers something different: strength, weight, durability. But it also presents a challenge. It is not easily shaped. It resists change. And so, early builders had to adapt. Instead of shaping the material, they learned to select it, choosing stones that fit together naturally, stacking them carefully, balancing weight against weight. There is a quiet art to this, a sense of patience. Each stone placed with attention, because once it is set, it does not move easily. Over time, this method creates something remarkable. Walls that feel solid, enduring. Structures that can withstand not just seasons, but years. And yet stone also requires effort. It must be lifted, carried, positioned. And so building with stone is slower, more deliberate. But in that slowness, there is stability. Now return to a place filled with trees. Wood becomes the primary material, flexible, light compared to stone, easier to shape. Branches can be cut, trimmed, arranged. Frames can be built. Supports can be placed in ways that distribute weight. Wood allows for a different kind of construction. More open, more adaptable. A structure can be expanded more easily, adjusted more quickly. But wood also has its limits. It can rot, it can burn, it can weaken over time. And so, builders begin to think about protection, how to keep wood dry, how to shield it from fire. Roofs become more important. Overhangs extend outward. Design begins to respond to material. Each material in its own way teaches something. Earth teaches shaping. Stone teaches stability. Wood teaches flexibility. And early builders learn from all of them, not through formal study, but through experience, through building, failing, adjusting. And over time, something subtle begins to happen. Materials are no longer used in isolation. They are combined, a stone foundation to anchor the structure, mud brick walls to build upward, a wooden roof to shelter from above, each material playing a role, each contributing its strength. This is the beginning of composite building, a quiet innovation, not announced but discovered, because it makes sense. Why rely on one material when many can work together? And in this cooperation of materials, structures become more resilient, more adaptable, more capable of lasting. If you walk through a growing settlement at this stage, you might begin to notice differences between structures. Some are newer, some older, some built with care, others with urgency. Each one tells a story of who built it, of what materials were available, of what knowledge was applied. And over time, patterns begin to emerge. Certain techniques prove more reliable, certain combinations more effective, and these patterns are remembered, passed along, not in written form, but through demonstration. A younger builder watches an older one, learns how to mix the earth just right, how to place stones so they hold. Knowledge flows quietly, from hand to hand, and as this knowledge spreads, the quality of construction improves. Walls become more consistent, roofs more stable. The settlement begins to feel more secure. But materials are not just about structure. they also shape experience. A mud brick wall holds warmth during the day, releasing it slowly at night. A stone wall stays cool, even under the sun. A wooden structure creaks softly in the wind. Each material creates a different atmosphere, a different feeling, and over time, people become aware of this. Not in words, but in comfort. This place feels warm. That place feels cool. This structure feels solid. And these feelings influence future building. Materials are chosen not just for strength, but for how they shape life. Another quiet development begins as well. Finishing. At first, structures are raw, rough surfaces, visible joints. But gradually, people begin to smooth, to refine. Walls are coated with finer layers of clay. Surfaces are shaped more carefully, not just for function, but for appearance. This is the beginning of aesthetic awareness. The idea that buildings can be more than just practical. They can be pleasing, comforting, even beautiful. This too is subtle, but important, because it reflects a deeper connection to place, a desire not just to survive, but to live well. As these ideas take hold, building becomes more than a task. It becomes a craft, something that can be improved, refined, perfected over time. And with craft comes identity. Different settlements begin to build in different ways, not just because of materials, but because of tradition. This is how we shape our bricks. This is how we lay our stones. This is how we build our roofs. And in these differences, the earliest forms of architectural style begin to emerge, quietly, without names, but clearly present. If you pause now and imagine the settlement once more, you might notice how it has changed. It feels more grounded, more structured. Materials are no longer just gathered and used. They are understood, respected, worked with care. And in that understanding, something powerful has taken root. The ability to shape the physical world with intention, to take what the land offers and transform it into something lasting. This is not yet the grandeur of cities, not yet, but it is the foundation. Because every great structure, every towering wall, every complex building begins with a simple act, a hand reaching down, lifting something from the earth and placing it carefully where it belongs. As materials became better understood, another layer of the story began to unfold. It was not about what was built, it was about how. Because even the strongest stone, the finest clay, the most flexible wood cannot shape itself. It requires hands, careful, steady hands. And over time, those hands began to work together in new and organized ways. If you imagine walking through a growing settlement at dawn, you might notice a soft rhythm already beginning. Someone gathering water, someone preparing clay, someone arranging stones in quiet concentration. There is no command being given, no loud direction. And yet, work is happening, coordinated, purposeful. This is the beginning of organized labor, not as a system written down, but as a pattern that emerges naturally. Because as building becomes more complex, it can no longer be done alone. A single person can shape a brick, but building a wall requires many, lifting, placing, aligning, each action connected to the next. And so, cooperation deepens. One person mixes the mud, another shapes it into bricks. Others carry those bricks to where they are needed. There is a flow, a quiet chain of effort, and within that flow, something important begins to appear. Roles, not fixed, not rigid, but present. Some individuals become more skilled at certain tasks. A steady hand at shaping materials, a keen eye for placing stones, a sense of balance when building upward. These skills are noticed, and over time, they are relied upon. This person is good at this. That person understands that. And so, work begins to distribute itself, not by force, but by ability. This is the earliest form of specialization, a subtle but powerful shift. Because when people focus on what they do well, the quality of work improves, structures become stronger, processes become smoother, and the settlement begins to function more efficiently. But hands alone are not always enough. As tasks grow more demanding, people begin to look for ways to extend their effort, to make work easier, more precise, and so tools begin to evolve. At first, they are simple. A stone used to strike another stone. A stick used to dig into the earth. But even these simple tools make a difference. They allow for greater control, greater force, and with that, new possibilities emerge. A sharper edge can cut wood more cleanly. A heavier object can break stone more effectively. Gradually, tools become more refined. Stones are shaped deliberately, not just picked up. Handles are added, extending reach and leverage. A tool is no longer just an object. It is an extension of the hand. And with this extension, the nature of work begins to change. Tasks that once required great effort become more manageable. Actions become more precise. A wall can be aligned more carefully. A surface smoothed more evenly. The quality of building improves, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. And as tools improve, so does the understanding of how to use them. A rhythm develops. Strike, adjust, place, cut, shape, fit. These actions repeat again and again until they become almost instinctive. If you listen closely, you might hear it. The soft tapping of stone against stone. The steady scraping of tools shaping wood. It is not loud, but it is constant. A quiet sound of creation. As work becomes more organized, another layer begins to form. Timing. Not everything can be done at once. Some tasks must come before others. The ground must be prepared before a foundation is laid. Bricks must be shaped and dried before they can be used. This introduces sequence, an understanding that building is not just about effort, but about order. Do this first, then that. And so, work begins to follow a kind of flow, a natural progression, not planned on paper, but understood through experience. If something is done too soon, it may fail. If done too late, it may delay everything else. And so, timing becomes part of the craft, a quiet awareness of when to act. Another change begins to appear as well, scale. As settlements grow, structures become larger. Not just individual shelters, but shared spaces, places where many people gather. These require more effort, more coordination, more hands. And so, groups begin to work together in larger numbers. A wall is no longer built by a few individuals, but by many, working side by side, lifting together, placing together. There is a sense of shared purpose, not spoken loudly, but felt, because these structures belong to everyone, and in building them, people become more connected. Effort becomes collective. The result becomes shared. This is an important moment, because it marks a shift from individual building to communal construction. And from that shift, something deeper begins to grow, a sense of belonging not just to a place, but to a process. We build this together, but working together also brings challenges. Coordination must become clearer. Movements must align. If one person moves too quickly or another too slowly, the process can falter. And so, communication becomes more important. Not complex language, but simple signals, a gesture, a call, a shared understanding of what comes next. Over time, these signals become more refined, more consistent, and with that consistency, work becomes smoother, more fluid. Another quiet development begins to take shape. Knowledge is no longer just individual, it becomes shared. If someone discovers a better way to shape a tool, others observe. If a more stable method of building is found, it is repeated. Learning becomes collective, passed through observation, through imitation, and slowly a kind of tradition begins to form. This is how we do this. This is how we build, not written, but remembered. And as these traditions grow stronger, they begin to define the settlement, not just in appearance, but in practice. This is how work flows here. This is how we cooperate. And within that, a quiet order emerges, not strict, not enforced, but present. If you step back and observe, you might notice how different this feels from the early days. Work is no longer scattered. It has rhythm, it has structure, it has purpose. And within that purpose, something else begins to appear. Pride, not loud or boastful, but quiet. A sense that the work matters, that the structures being built are not temporary, they are lasting. And that changes how people approach their tasks. Care increases, attention deepens, because what is built today will remain for others, for the future. This awareness adds weight to every action, every placement of a stone, every shaping of a brick. And in that weight, the work becomes more meaningful. Tools continue to evolve, becoming more specialized. Different tools for different tasks. Some for cutting, some for shaping, some for lifting or aligning. And with each new tool, the range of what can be built expands. Structures can grow taller, more precise, more complex. But always, beneath it all, there are the hands, steady, patient, guided by experience, working together. If you return once more to the settlement at the end of a long day, you might notice something different in the air, a quiet satisfaction. The wall stands a little higher, the structure a little more complete. Progress is visible, not dramatic, but real. And as people rest, the tools are set aside, but not forgotten, because tomorrow they will be lifted again. Work will continue. The rhythm will return, and slowly, steadily, the settlement will grow, not just in size, but in complexity, in coordination, in shared effort. And from this quiet order of work, something greater will emerge. As the work of building became more organized, and as materials and tools grew more familiar, something new began to form within these early communities. It was not something you could see at first, not like a wall or a roof or a path worn into the earth. It was something quieter, an idea, a way of thinking, because at some point, people began to do more than build by habit. They began to build with intention, to ask not just how something could be made, but why it worked the way it did. This is where the earliest traces of engineering begin, not as a formal discipline, not as written knowledge, but as careful observation repeated over time. If you imagine a builder standing beside a wall that has just collapsed, there is a pause, a moment of reflection. What caused this? Was the base too weak? Was the weight too uneven? Did the materials fail, or the arrangement? These questions do not arrive all at once. They emerge slowly, but once they do, they begin to change everything. Because now, building is no longer just reaction. It becomes understanding. The first ideas are simple. A wider base makes a structure more stable. Heavier materials should rest lower, not higher. Weight must be supported evenly. These ideas are not written down, but they are remembered, passed from one builder to another, and over time, they become principles, quiet rules that guide construction. If you look closely at early structures, you might begin to notice subtle changes. Walls are no longer perfectly vertical. They lean slightly inward, providing strength. Foundations are laid more carefully, sometimes with larger stones to anchor the base. These adjustments are small, but they matter. They are the difference between something that stands briefly and something that endures. Another realization begins to take shape. Balance. Not just physical balance, but distribution. If weight is placed unevenly, structures strain. If forces push from one side more than another, something shifts. And so, builders begin to think in terms of forces, not in the language we use today, but in feeling. This side is heavier. That part is under pressure. They respond by adjusting, by reinforcing, by redistributing. And slowly, an intuitive understanding of stability begins to grow. If you imagine a simple doorway being formed, two vertical supports with something placed across the top, you can sense the challenge. The top piece must be held in place. It must not fall. At first, this might be done with a flat stone or wooden beam, but over time, people begin to notice something interesting. If the top is shaped slightly differently, if it curves or angles, the weight can be directed downward rather than outward. This is the beginning of one of the most important ideas in early construction, the idea that shape influences strength, that how something is formed affects how it holds. These insights are not sudden breakthroughs. They are quiet discoveries, found through repetition, through watching what holds and what fails. Another challenge emerges as structures grow larger. Distance. How do you support something that spans a wider space? A small shelter is simple, but a larger structure, one meant for many people, requires new thinking. Supports must be placed carefully. Materials must reach farther. And so, builders begin to experiment, adding more supports, changing the spacing, testing how far a beam can stretch before it bends. These experiments are not written as plans, they are lived. Each structure becomes a lesson. Each attempt adds to understanding. And slowly, a body of knowledge begins to form. Unspoken, but shared. This is how we build something wide. This is how we support something tall. And from this knowledge, structures begin to change. They become more ambitious, more confident, because now builders are not just reacting, they are anticipating, thinking ahead. Another quiet innovation begins to appear as well. Water management. At first, water was simply something to live near, but as settlements grew, it became something to manage. Rainwater could collect and damage structures. Flooding could disrupt entire areas, and so people began to guide water. Not with large systems, not yet, but with simple adjustments. Channels carved into the ground, slight slopes in the land to direct flow, roofs angled to let water run off. These are small actions, but they reflect a deeper understanding that the environment can be shaped, that natural forces can be guided, not just endured. This is another step toward engineering, the idea of control, not absolute control, but influence, a way of working with forces rather than against them. If you stand in a settlement during a heavy rain, you might notice how water moves, flowing along paths, avoiding certain areas. This is not accidental. It is the result of careful observation and quiet design. Another development begins to emerge in the form of measurement. not precise, not standardized, but present. Builders begin to compare lengths, using their own bodies as reference, an arm's reach, a step, the width of a hand. These become informal units, ways of ensuring consistency. If a wall must be straight, its length must be measured. If a structure must be balanced, its sides must align. And so, measurement becomes part of the process, not exact but intentional. And from this intention, greater precision follows. Structures become more uniform, spaces more defined. The settlement begins to feel more ordered. Another idea quietly takes shape: repetition. If something works once, it can be done again. If a structure is stable, its method can be copied. And so, successful designs begin to repeat. A certain type of wall, a particular roof shape, these become familiar, trusted, and over time, they evolve, refined with each new attempt. This is the beginning of design patterns, not formalized but recognized, and with recognition comes efficiency. Builders no longer start from nothing. They build on what is known, what has already proven itself. This allows for faster construction, more reliable results, and with that, the settlement grows more quickly, more confidently. As these early engineering ideas develop, something else begins to change: perspective. Builders begin to see structures not just as objects, but as systems, connected parts working together. A wall supports a roof, a foundation supports a wall. Each element depends on the others, and so building becomes an act of integration, of understanding how parts interact. This awareness deepens the craft, adds complexity, and with complexity comes possibility. Structures can now be imagined differently, not just as simple enclosures, but as composed forms, spaces within spaces, openings, passages. A new kind of creativity begins to emerge, one guided not just by need, but by understanding. If you walk through the settlement now, you might notice how it feels different, more intentional, more structured. There is a sense that things are not just placed, but designed, even if no one uses that word. The placement of a doorway, the angle of a roof, the alignment of walls, all of it reflects thought, careful, accumulated thought, and within that, the first true foundations of architecture begin to appear, not as art alone, not as function alone, but as a balance between the two, guided by early engineering, shaped by experience, and carried forward through memory. As the day comes to a close and the work slows, the settlement rests, but the ideas remain, quietly present, carried in the minds of those who built. And tomorrow, when the work begins again, those ideas will guide the hands, refining, improving, expanding, and step by step, structure by structure, the path towards cities becomes clearer, not through sudden leaps, but through quiet understanding. As knowledge deepened and building became more confident, something remarkable began to happen. Settlements that were once small and quiet began to grow beyond themselves, not suddenly, not in a single moment, but gradually, almost gently. They expanded. More structures appeared. More people arrived. More activity filled the spaces between. And slowly, these settlements began to cross a threshold. They became something new, not just places to live, but places of significance, the earliest cities. If you imagine approaching one of these early cities from a distance, you might first notice its shape. It does not blend into the landscape as seamlessly as the earlier settlements once did. It stands out. Structures rise closer together. Walls form clearer boundaries. paths converge toward central spaces. There is a sense of density, of concentration, a feeling that many lives are unfolding in one place. And as you step closer, that feeling becomes more detailed. You begin to see movement, people carrying materials, others working on structures, groups gathered in shared areas. There is a rhythm here, but it is more complex now, more layered, because a city is not just a larger settlement. It is a network, a place where many activities happen at once, interconnected, dependent on one another. At the heart of many early cities, a central space begins to emerge, not by accident, but through use, a place where people gather regularly, for exchange, for discussion, for shared activity. This space becomes important. It holds the city together. Around it, structures begin to organize themselves. Paths lead toward it. Buildings face it. It becomes a kind of anchor, a point of orientation. If you were to stand there quietly observing, you might notice how different people come for different reasons. Some bring goods, food, tools, materials. Others come to share knowledge, to speak, to listen. And in these interactions, something new begins to grow. Exchange, not just of objects, but of ideas. This is one of the defining features of a city. It becomes a place where knowledge accumulates, where innovations spread, where one person's discovery becomes many people's understanding. And this accelerates growth, because ideas, once shared, can be built upon, refined, expanded. Another change becomes visible as cities grow. Specialization deepens. In smaller settlements, people performed many tasks. But in cities, roles become more distinct. Some focus on building, others on crafting tools, others on preparing food. And as these roles become more defined, skill increases. A builder who builds often becomes more precise. A craftsperson who shapes tools becomes more refined. Quality improves, efficiency grows. And with efficiency, the city can support more people, more complexity. Structures begin to reflect this. Buildings are no longer just shelters. Some are designed for specific purposes. Storage spaces, work areas, places for gathering, each with its own form, its own layout. And as these specialized spaces increase, the city becomes more organized, more structured. You can begin to recognize different areas. This part for living, that part for working, this area for gathering, not rigidly separated, but distinct. Another quiet transformation takes place as well. Height. As space becomes more limited, building begins to move upward, not dramatically at first, but gradually. Walls grow taller, structures gain additional layers. This introduces new challenges. Weight must be supported differently, foundations must be stronger, and so the engineering ideas developed earlier become even more important. Builders must think carefully about balance, about support, about how each level interacts with the one below. And with each successful structure, confidence grows. What once seemed difficult becomes possible. Another defining feature of early cities begins to appear. Boundaries. At first, settlements were open. But as cities grow, there is a need to define edges, not always for defense, but for clarity. Where does the city begin? Where does it end? Walls begin to appear, simple at first, earth mounds, stone barriers, marking the edge of the built environment. Over time, these boundaries become more defined, stronger, more deliberate. They create a sense of enclosure, of identity. Inside is the city, outside is the surrounding land. This distinction changes how people think. It reinforces belonging, a sense of being part of something larger. And within those boundaries, Life becomes more interconnected. People depend on one another more closely. Food must be distributed. Resources must be managed. And this requires coordination, a deeper level of organization. Not always formal, but necessary, because the larger the city becomes, the more complex its needs. Another subtle but important shift begins to take place. Time itself feels different in a city. In smaller settlements, life followed natural rhythms closely, day and night, seasons. But in a city, human activity adds another layer. Work continues in different forms throughout the day. Some tasks extend into the evening. There is a sense of continuity, of ongoing movement. The city does not rest in the same way. It breathes, steadily, constantly. And within that rhythm, something begins to emerge. Memory. Not just individual memory, but collective memory. Stories tied to places within the city. This building was made during a time of change. That space has always been a gathering point. The city begins to hold history, layered within its structures, embedded in its layout. Each addition builds upon what came before. And over time, the city becomes a record of effort, of decisions, of growth. If you walk through its paths, you are not just moving through space, you are moving through time. Past choices shaping present experience. And this continuity gives the city a kind of depth, a presence. It feels established, enduring. But cities are not static. They continue to evolve as new people arrive, as new ideas spread. Structures are modified, spaces are repurposed. Nothing is fixed. Everything is in motion. But the motion is guided, shaped by what already exists. This creates a balance between stability and change. And within that balance, cities thrive. Some grow near rivers, becoming centers of trade. Others in valleys, becoming hubs of agriculture. Some along coasts, connecting distant lands. Each city reflects its environment, but also transcends it, because now the city itself becomes a force, shaping how people live, how they think, how they interact. If you pause at the edge of one of these early cities at sunset, you might see lights beginning to appear, fires within structures, movement along paths, a soft glow. There is a sense of life continuing, of activity layered upon activity. And in that moment, the transformation becomes clear. This is no longer just a place where people stay. It is a place where systems exist, where cooperation has scaled, where knowledge flows, where structures support not just survival, but complexity. The city has arrived, quietly, gradually, built not in a single act, but through countless small ones. And yet, even now, it is still becoming, still growing, still learning, because a city is never truly finished. It is always in the process of being built. By the time cities began to take shape, real, recognizable cities, something profound had already happened, not just to the land, but to the people. Because building a city is not only a physical act, it is a transformation of how humans understand themselves. If you stand quietly within one of these early cities, perhaps near a central gathering place, you might notice something subtle in the atmosphere, a sense of continuity, people moving with purpose, structures standing with quiet confidence, paths worn smooth by countless footsteps. Nothing feels accidental anymore. Everything feels connected. And within that connection lies the deeper meaning of the city. Because before cities, life was immediate, focused on the present moment, finding food, seeking shelter, responding to the environment as it unfolded. But in a city, something changes. Time stretches. The future begins to matter more. People build not just for themselves, but for those who will come after. A wall is raised with the understanding that it will stand for years. A structure is shaped with the expectation that others will use it. This introduces a new kind of thinking, a long view, a sense that life extends beyond the individual moment. And with that comes responsibility, because to build something that lasts is to care about what happens next. It is to imagine a future you may not see, and to contribute to it anyway. This is one of the quiet meanings of a city. It is a place where people invest in time itself. Another change becomes visible in the way people relate to one another. In smaller settlements, relationships were simple. Everyone knew everyone else. But in a city, the number of people grows. Faces become unfamiliar. And yet, cooperation must continue. People depend on others they may not know directly. The builder relies on the one who gathers materials. The one who prepares food supports many others. This creates a web of connection, invisible but essential. And within that web, a new kind of trust begins to form. Not just personal trust, but collective trust. A belief that the system will hold, that others will do their part, that the city itself will function. This is not always perfect. There are tensions, misunderstandings, but the overall structure remains because the city requires it. And so, people adapt. They learn to live within complexity, to navigate shared spaces, to cooperate across differences. This is a quiet but powerful shift because it expands what it means to belong. You are no longer just part of a small group. You are part of something larger, something layered, something dynamic. Another aspect begins to emerge as well. Identity. In a city, people begin to define themselves not just by who they are, but by where they are. This is our place. This is how we build. This is how we live. The city becomes a shared reference point, a source of pride, of belonging, and within that identity, culture begins to take shape, not in a single moment, but through repetition, through shared practices, through the ways people interact with their environment and each other. Certain building styles become familiar. Certain spaces take on meaning. A gathering place becomes more than just an open area. It becomes a symbol, a place where important moments occur. And over time, these symbols accumulate. The city becomes not just a physical space, but a cultural one, a place where meaning is layered into every structure, every path, every corner. If you walk slowly through such a city, you might begin to sense this, a feeling that the space holds more than what is visible, that each structure carries memory, that each area reflects a story. And this sense deepens the experience of living there, because people are not just moving through space, they are moving through shared history. Another quiet realization begins to form within cities, the idea of permanence. Not absolute permanence, but relative. Buildings last longer than individuals. Paths remain even as people change, and this creates a continuity that extends beyond a single lifetime. A person may build something and know that it will remain after they are gone. This thought is both grounding and expansive. It connects the present to the future, and in doing so, it changes how people see their actions. Work becomes more than immediate effort. It becomes contribution, a way of adding to something ongoing. This is one of the most profound aspects of city building. It transforms individual effort into collective legacy. But with this comes another awareness, fragility, because even as cities grow and strengthen, they are not immune to change. Structures can decay, resources can shift, challenges can arise. And so, the work of maintaining a city becomes as important as building it. Repair, adaptation, a continuous process. This introduces another layer of responsibility, not just to create, but to sustain. And within that responsibility, a deeper relationship with the environment develops. Cities must remain connected to the land that supports them. Water must be managed. Materials must be sourced carefully. The balance between growth and sustainability becomes essential. Even if it is not always fully understood, if that balance is lost, the city can struggle. And so, awareness continues to grow, quietly, gradually. Another important shift appears in the way knowledge is treated. In a city, knowledge becomes more valuable because it can be shared more widely. A better building method can spread quickly. A new tool design can be adopted by many. This accelerates learning, and with that acceleration, innovation increases. Cities become places of discovery, not through formal systems, but through proximity, through interaction, through the simple fact that many minds are working together. This is one of the reasons cities continue to grow. They generate their own momentum. Ideas lead to improvements. Improvements lead to growth. And growth creates more opportunities for ideas. It is a quiet cycle, but a powerful one. If you pause again, perhaps at the edge of the city as evening falls, you might notice how different this place feels compared to the early settlements. There is a density of life, a layering of activity, a sense that many things are happening at once, yet somehow fitting together. It is not perfect, but it is functioning. And within that function, something remarkable has been achieved. Humans have created a shared environment that supports not just survival, but complexity, connection, memory, identity. The city is no longer just built from materials. It is built from relationships, from trust, from cooperation, from the willingness to participate in something larger than oneself. And perhaps that is what building a city truly means, not just shaping the land, but shaping how people live together, how they think, how they connect. It is a quiet revolution, one that unfolds slowly, but once it begins, it changes everything. And now, as the story begins to settle, we arrive at something softer, not an ending, but a reflection. Because the story of how ancient cities were built is not only about structures, it is about something deeper, something that continues even now. If you imagine standing in one of those early cities again, perhaps at the edge, where the built world meets the open land, you might feel a quiet stillness. The work has slowed for the day. Voices are softer. Light fades gently across walls shaped by many hands. And in that moment, it becomes easier to see what has been created. Not just buildings, but a pattern, a way of living, a shared effort layered over time. Each stone placed by someone who believed it mattered. Each wall raised with a sense, perhaps unspoken, that it would hold. And this is where the meaning of it all begins to deepen. Because cities are not simply made of materials. They are made of intention, of countless decisions, most of them small. Where to place a wall, how to shape a path, when to repair, when to rebuild. None of these decisions seem large on their own, but together, they create something vast, something that outlasts the individual. And this is one of the quiet truths of human creation. That meaning often emerges not from single acts, but from accumulation, from repetition, from continuity, from the willingness to keep building, even when the outcome is not fully known. If you trace the path From those earliest settlements, those simple gatherings of shelters, to the first cities, you can feel this continuity. Nothing was sudden. Nothing was imposed all at once. Everything unfolded gradually. One idea leading to another. One solution giving rise to a new question. And in that steady unfolding, something remarkable took shape. Humans learned not just how to live on the land, but how to shape it. And in shaping it, they began to shape themselves. Because building a city requires more than physical effort. It requires patience, to work over long periods of time, to accept that change is slow. It requires cooperation, to align with others, to contribute to something shared. It requires imagination, to see what is not yet there, to believe it can exist. These qualities, developed through the act of building, become part of the people themselves. They carry forward from one generation to the next, and so the city becomes more than a place. It becomes a reflection of human thought, of human possibility. If you look closely at any ancient structure, no matter how simple, you might notice something subtle, a slight variation in shape, a small imperfection in alignment. These are not flaws, they are traces, evidence that the structure was made by hands, by individuals, each bringing their own rhythm, their own understanding. And yet, despite these variations, the whole remains cohesive, stable, functional. This balance between individuality and unity is at the heart of every city. It is what allows many people to contribute without losing the sense of a shared whole. And this balance continues to echo through time, because even now, in the cities of today, the same principles remain, different materials, different tools, but the same underlying patterns, people gathering, building, organizing, creating spaces that support life, connection, and continuity. If you consider this, the story begins to feel less distant, less like something that happened long ago, and more like something ongoing, because every city, no matter how modern, carries within it the memory of those early beginnings, the first shelters, the first walls, the first attempts to stay, all of it layered, quietly, beneath what exists now. And perhaps that is one of the most calming aspects of this story, that human creation is not a sudden act, it is a process, a slow, steady unfolding, one that does not require perfection, only participation, only the willingness to contribute something, however small, to a larger whole. If you return once more to that early city, now fully formed in your mind, you might notice how it feels at rest. Not silent, but peaceful. The structures stand, holding the day's warmth. The paths lie still, waiting for tomorrow's footsteps. There is a sense of completion, but also of continuation, because the city is never truly finished. There will always be repairs, adjustments, new ideas. And this is not a flaw. It is the nature of creation, to remain open, to evolve, to respond to time. And in that openness, there is something reassuring, because it means that no single moment defines the whole. No single effort determines the outcome. Everything contributes, everything matters, in its own way. And so, as the light fades and the city settles into quiet, the story gently comes to rest, not with a final answer, but with a feeling, a sense that what was built long ago still speaks, not loudly, but softly, through the shapes of structures, through the patterns of spaces, through the quiet understanding that humans, given time and cooperation, can create something lasting, something meaningful, something that holds. And perhaps, as you imagine those early builders, moving slowly, placing each piece with care, you can feel a connection across time, a shared rhythm, a quiet continuity, because the act of building, of shaping the world with intention, is something deeply human, something that endures long after the work of any single day is done. And even as the city rests, something continues, not in the visible work of hands, not in the placing of stones or the shaping of walls, but beneath it all, in patterns that are quieter, less seen, yet just as essential, because once a city exists, it begins to develop rhythms of its own, not just daily routines, but deeper, slower cycles. If you imagine waking before dawn within one of these early cities, you might notice how still everything feels. The air is cool, the paths are empty, but this stillness is only temporary, because slowly, almost imperceptibly, movement begins again. A door opens, footsteps sound softly on packed earth, a small fire is rekindled, the city is waking, and with that waking comes a rhythm, not imposed, but emerging. Some rise early to prepare food, others begin gathering materials, some move toward shared spaces, anticipating the day's work, each action small on its own, but together they form a pattern, a quiet synchronization. This is the daily rhythm of the city, but beneath it, there are others, longer rhythms, seasonal shifts, changes that influence not just what is done, but how the city itself functions. In times of warmth, activity expands, work stretches longer into the day, building continues at a steady pace, materials dry more quickly, movement feels easier. But when colder seasons arrive, everything adjusts. Work slows, attention turns inward, structures are maintained rather than expanded, fire becomes central, spaces grow more enclosed, and so the city breathes with the seasons, expanding, contracting, always adapting. This adaptability becomes one of its quiet strengths, because a city that does not respond to change cannot endure. If you walk through the city during a period of change, perhaps the beginning of a rainy season, you might notice subtle preparations. Channels are cleared, roofs are checked, materials are stored more carefully. These actions are not dramatic, but they reflect awareness, a collective understanding that the environment will shift and the city must respond. And so, maintenance becomes part of the rhythm, not just building, but caring, repairing small cracks before they widen, replacing weakened supports. This ongoing attention is what allows the city to last, not a single act of construction, but continuous care. Another rhythm begins to reveal itself as well. Movement within the city. Paths are no longer just routes. They become patterns of flow. Some paths are used more frequently than others. Some areas become quieter, while others grow busier. Over time, these patterns become predictable. You begin to know where people will be at certain times, where activity gathers, where stillness remains. This creates a kind of spatial rhythm, a living map, not drawn but experienced. If you follow one of the main paths through the city, you might notice how it connects different areas, from living spaces to work areas to shared gathering places. It is not a straight line. It curves gently, adapting to what already exists. And along this path, life unfolds. People pass one another, exchange small gestures, a quiet acknowledgement of shared presence. These interactions, though brief, add another layer to the rhythm, a social rhythm, moments of connection woven into movement. And over time, these small interactions strengthen the fabric of the city. Because a city is not just built from materials, it is built from relationships, from repeated encounters. From the familiarity of shared space, another deeper rhythm begins to emerge as well. Growth, not just physical growth, but generational. Children are born within the city. They grow up surrounded by its structures. They learn its patterns. Its paths become familiar. Its spaces meaningful. For them, the city is not something that was built. It is something that has always been. And yet, as they grow, they begin to contribute, to build, to shape. And so, the city carries forward, from one generation to the next, each adding something, each inheriting something. This creates a continuity that stretches across time, a rhythm not of days or seasons, but of lives. If you pause and consider this, it becomes clear how deeply the city is connected to memory. Not just individual memory, but collective memory. A place where experiences accumulate, where stories are tied to locations, where certain areas hold significance, and this memory influences future actions. A place where something important happened is treated differently. A structure that has stood for many years is respected. These subtle acknowledgements shape behavior, guide decisions, and in doing so, they become part of the rhythm. Another layer begins to form in the way resources move through the city. Food is gathered, brought in, distributed. Materials are collected, shaped, used. Nothing remains static. Everything flows, and managing this flow becomes essential. Too much in one place, and it becomes waste. Too little, and there is scarcity. And so, people begin to pay attention, to balance, to distribution. This is not yet a formal system, but it is an awareness, a sensitivity to movement. And from that sensitivity, systems begin to form, quietly, gradually. If you observe closely, you might notice how certain areas become associated with certain activities, not by design, but by repetition. This space is often used for preparing food, that area for shaping materials. And over time, these associations become expectations. The city begins to organize itself more clearly, not rigidly, but reliably. And this reliability adds to the rhythm, because when people know where things happen, movement becomes smoother, more efficient, less uncertain. Another quiet transformation takes place in how time is experienced. In a city, time is no longer only natural, it becomes structured by activity. Work begins at certain moments. Gathering happens at others. There is a sense of sequence, of progression. And within that progression, people begin to anticipate, to plan, to align their actions with the rhythm of the city. This creates a kind of harmony, not perfect, but present. A coordination of effort that allows many individuals to function together. And this harmony is what sustains the city, because without it, complexity would become confusion. If you return again to the city at night, after all movement has slowed, you might sense how these rhythms linger, even in stillness. The structures stand shaped by countless cycles of use. The paths hold the memory of movement. The air carries a quiet sense of continuity, as if the city is resting, but not pausing, because tomorrow the rhythms will begin again, and they will continue, day after day, season after season, building not just structures, but patterns, patterns that define how life unfolds. And within those patterns, something deeper becomes visible. The city is no longer just a place. It is a process, a living system, one that evolves, but also endures. And as these rhythms deepen, they prepare the city for something new, something that will add another layer of complexity, another dimension to its existence. But for now, we remain here, listening, observing, feeling the quiet pulse beneath the surface. the steady rhythm of a city that has learned not just how to build, but how to continue. And as the rhythms of the city settle into something steady, something else begins to extend outward, beyond the walls, beyond the familiar paths, into the wider world, because no city, no matter how carefully built, exists entirely alone. Even in its earliest form, it begins to reach, quietly, gradually. At first, these connections are simple. A path leading away from the settlement, a trail shaped by repeated journeys. Someone leaves in the morning and returns by evening, carrying something new, a different kind of stone, a plant not found nearby, a story of another place. These small movements begin to form lines, lines that stretch outward, and as they are used again and again, they become more defined, more reliable, the beginnings of roads, not paved, not marked, but known, understood. If you imagine following one of these early paths away from the city, you might notice how it weaves through the landscape. It follows the easiest route, avoiding steep slopes, tracing the edge of water. It adapts to the land, just as the city once did. And along this path, something important begins to happen. Exchange, not just within the city, but between places. Another settlement may lie beyond the horizon, different but similar, built from its own materials, shaped by its own environment. And when people from these places meet, there is a moment of quiet recognition. They see something familiar in something unfamiliar. And from that recognition, interaction begins. At first, it is cautious, a simple sharing, a tool traded for another, food exchanged. But over time, these interactions grow more frequent, more comfortable. And with frequency comes trust, not absolute, but enough to allow exchange to deepen. This is how networks begin, not through design, but through repetition. One journey leads to another, one exchange leads to many, and slowly the city becomes part of something larger, a web of connections. If you return to the city and observe its central space once more, you might notice new things appearing, objects that do not match the local materials, a stone with a different color, a crafted item shaped in a way not seen before. These are signs, evidence that the city is no longer isolated, that it is receiving and giving. And with this exchange comes change. New materials introduce new possibilities, a stronger tool, a more durable building method. Ideas travel alongside objects, quietly, carried in the memory of those who move between places. A builder might observe a different technique in another settlement, a new way of shaping a joint, a different method of reinforcing a wall. And when they return, that idea is carried back, tested, adapted, and if it works, it becomes part of the city's knowledge. This is how innovation spreads, not through instruction, but through connection. And as these connections deepen, the city begins to evolve more quickly, because it is no longer limited to its own discoveries. It draws from others, learns from others, and contributes in return. Another quiet change begins to take place as well. Movement becomes more purposeful. Journeys are no longer only for survival. They become intentional, planned. Someone travels not just to explore, but to obtain something specific, a material, a tool, a resource that is not available nearby. And this intention shapes the paths further. Routes become more direct, more frequently used. Over time, they become dependable. If you follow this path, you will reach that place. And in that reliability, distance becomes less uncertain. The world feels connected, not all at once, but gradually. And with that connection comes a new awareness. There are other ways of building, other ways of living. The city begins to see itself in relation to others, not just as a place, but as part of a wider landscape of human activity. This perspective adds depth, encourages comparison, inspires change. If another place builds differently, why? If another material works better, how? These questions begin to circulate quietly, encouraging observation, encouraging adaptation. Another development emerges within the city itself. As exchange increases, certain individuals begin to take on new roles. Those who travel more often, who understand the paths, who know where to find certain materials. They become connectors, not formally recognized, but essential. They carry not just goods, but information. And in doing so, they help shape the city's growth. Because what enters the city influences what is built, what is used, what is valued. And over time, these influences accumulate. The city becomes a blend of local tradition and distant inspiration. If you pause again in the central space, you might sense this blending, a structure that combines familiar forms with new techniques, an object that reflects both local material and distant design. The city is becoming more complex, more layered, and with that layering, something else begins to form, identity in relation, not just who we are, but how we differ. This place builds like this, that place builds like that. These differences become noticeable, and in noticing them, people begin to reflect, to choose, to refine their own methods. This is how culture deepens, through interaction, through comparison, through the quiet exchange of ideas. Another important shift begins to take place. Scale. As connections expand, the city's influence grows, not just within its walls, but beyond them. Paths leading outward become more active, more traveled, and along these paths, smaller settlements may begin to form, connected to the city, influenced by it, and in turn, influencing it. This creates a network, a region, not a single city, but a group of connected places, each with its own character, yet linked through movement, through exchange, through shared understanding. If you imagine looking at this from above, not in a literal sense, but in thought, you might see lines extending outward, paths connecting places, movement flowing along them, and at certain points, gathering. Where paths intersect, where exchange is frequent, these points begin to grow, sometimes becoming cities themselves. And so the process continues, expanding outward, layer by layer, connection by connection. But even as the city reaches outward, it remains grounded, its foundations still rooted in the land, its rhythms still shaped by its environment. The external connections add to it, but do not replace its core. And this balance becomes important, because too much change can disrupt stability. Too little can limit growth. And so, the city learns to adapt carefully, to integrate what is useful, to maintain what is essential. This is not a conscious strategy, but a gradual process, guided by experience, by what works and what does not. As evening falls once more and the city settles into quiet, you might sense how these connections continue even in stillness. Beyond the visible structures, beyond the immediate surroundings, there are paths leading outward, carrying movement, carrying ideas, carrying the quiet continuity of human connection. And through those paths, the city becomes something more than itself, not just a place, but a point within a larger story, one that continues to unfold. And as the city extends outward, as its paths reach into distant lands and return again, something even quieter begins to take shape within it, something that cannot be held, something that cannot be seen in stone or clay, but something that lingers gently. The city begins to remember, not in the way a single person remembers, but in a deeper, more collective sense. A memory carried not in words alone, but in structure, in space, in repetition. If you walk slowly through the city now, tracing the same paths worn smooth by time, you might begin to feel it, a subtle familiarity, not just of place, but of pattern. This turn leads somewhere known. That open space holds a certain meaning, even if you had never been there before. There is a sense that it has been there for a long time, and that feeling is not accidental. It is the result of accumulation, because every structure that remains, every wall that stands, every path that continues to be used, carries something forward, a decision, a moment, an intention from the past. And when these accumulate over generations, they form something powerful, a kind of living memory. If you imagine a builder placing a stone many years ago, they may not have thought of this. They were focused on the task, on balance, on fit, on making it hold. But that stone remains, and others build upon it, and others walk beside it, and slowly it becomes part of something larger, something that endures. And this is how memory settles into the city, not announced, but embedded. Another layer of this memory forms through repetition. Certain actions happen again and again in the same places. A space used for gathering continues to gather people. A path used for travel continues to guide movement. And over time, these repetitions become expectations. This is where we meet. This is where we walk. And when expectations form, they create stability, a sense of continuity. Even as people change, even as generations pass, the city remains familiar, recognizable. And in that recognition, there is comfort, a quiet reassurance that something holds steady. If you pause near one of the older structures, perhaps one that has been repaired many times, you might notice how it carries layers. A foundation laid long ago, walls adjusted and reinforced, surfaces smoothed and reshaped. It is not one moment of building, it is many. And those moments are still present, not separately, but together. This is the nature of the city. It does not erase its past, it builds upon it, layer after layer, and in doing so, it becomes deeper, more complex, more meaningful. Another kind of memory begins to form as well, a memory of knowledge, techniques that have been tested over time, methods that have proven reliable, a certain way of placing stones that holds better, a way of shaping materials that lasts longer. These are not written down, but they are remembered, passed from one person to another, from one generation to the next, and over time they become tradition, not rigid, but trusted. This is how we build here, and in that trust there is continuity, a link between past and present. But memory is not only about preserving what was, it also shapes what comes next, because when people build, they are influenced by what already exists. They align with it, they adapt to it, they respond to it. A new structure does not stand alone. It connects, it fits within the existing pattern, and in doing so, it continues the story. This creates a sense of coherence, a city that feels unified, even as it grows, even as it changes. If you walk further toward the edge where newer structures begin to appear, you might notice a subtle difference. The forms are slightly varied, the materials perhaps combined in new ways. These are signs of change, of adaptation. But even here, the connection remains. The new does not replace the old. It extends it. And in that extension, the city remains continuous. Another quiet dimension of memory reveals itself in how people move through the city. Not just physically, but mentally. They know where things are, where to find what they need, where to go at certain times. This knowledge is not always spoken. It is carried internally, a shared understanding of space. And this shared understanding allows the city to function smoothly, because people do not need to rediscover it each day. They remember, collectively. And this memory reduces uncertainty, creates ease, allows life to flow. Another layer of memory exists in the stories people tell, not just of events, but of places. This building has stood for many seasons. That space was once different. These stories connect people to the city, give meaning to its structures, and as they are told and retold, they become part of the city itself, not written into its walls, but felt within them. If you sit quietly and listen, you might sense this, a subtle presence, as if the city holds echoes of voices, of effort, of time passing. And yet, it is not heavy, it is gentle, a quiet layering that gives depth to the present moment. Another aspect of this living memory is adaptation, because memory is not static. It does not freeze the city in one form. Instead, it guides change. When a structure weakens, it is repaired using known methods. When a new need arises, it is addressed using existing knowledge. The past informs the present, but does not limit it. And in this balance, the city remains alive, responsive, evolving. If you imagine the city across many years, you might see how it shifts. Structures added, others adjusted, paths slightly redirected. And yet, the core remains. The patterns persist, the memory holds. This continuity is what allows the city to endure, not as a fixed object, but as a living system, one that carries its history forward, while remaining open to change. As night settles once more, and the city becomes quiet again, this memory does not disappear. It rests, held within the structures, within the spaces, within the shared understanding of those who live there. And when morning comes, it will awaken again, guiding actions, shaping decisions, continuing the quiet process of becoming. Because the city is never only what it is in this moment. It is also what it has been and what it is becoming, all at once, and in that gentle layering of time. The story continues,